Hi, I'm Hollis Taylor. I am an astrologer, a medium, a psychic, and I've been at this for a long time. I started way back when I was a young teen, and now I'm 50 years old. And I have studied all sorts of things from astrology and all sorts of metaphysical arts. And some of them have stuck with me longer than others. Two of my favorites, astrology and mediumship. And the interesting thing is that a while ago, a long while ago, like around 2020, during the pandemic, I was not doing so well because of some congenital heart difficulties I was challenged with. And I had this call to make a group for mediumship. Now, every year I would always do like a mediumship seance or something like that. Okay. And over time, this that year, 2020, of course, we weren't doing that in person, right? And I got this really strong call to make a group, and I did, and it got really, really large. And then over time, I was doing medium readings, professionally on a regular once I started to feel a little bit more energized enough to do that. And as I started to do that, I also was studying astrology with Nadiya Shah. I was actually part of her membership, superstars, as she would call us. And I was taking several classes a week and just diving in real deep because it was something I could do while I was sick. And the more I started to put the astrology together, I started to realize that not only was astrology just about your birth chart or about other interesting things like that, but it also told you a lot about past lives. And I began to study the nodes, um, and all sorts of things like that. I deep dove into everything about death astrology and medical astrology. Those are things that I'm very interested in because I'm also a wellness coach. And I started to I was also doing readings, as I said, professionally, medium readings mostly. And I just started to get this intuitive download that I should put together the mediumship and the astrology. And the interesting thing is that at the time I was actually coaching other mediums on how to put together like their healing modalities such as Reiki with their mediumship because that can be very helpful for people recovering from grief. And since I was a grief coach, it was obvious to me that there were some very tough questions for people that were suffering with grief that could be better answered in an astrology reading. Now, sometimes the answers would come through on a mediumship reading, but over time, I found that the astrology was more effective, especially when I started to just ask some of my clients if it was okay if I looked at their astrology chart and the chart of their recently passed loved ones, usually like their husband or maybe a parent, and sometimes a child. And as I would start to look at that, I started to notice a pattern that many astrologers have talked about. And I've taken all sorts of classes and read all sorts of books about death astrology. And I started to see the alignment of the nodes. And then depending on the death, meaning what was the circumstances of the death? Was it an accident? Well, then all of a sudden Mars and Uranus might be involved. And then if maybe um a person took their own life, you would see not that it was necessarily destined or fated, but that there was definitely a lot going on with their emotions, and I could usually even figure out what was going on for them at the moment, like if they had had some relationship things or money problems, or maybe it was something with their career. And this information began to support and help my clients. This information started to answer the questions of why. Now, sometimes it's just that time for that person to pass, of course. And sometimes it's more fated than other times. And sometimes it's just plain an accident. And and most of the times when it wasn't destined or anything like that, what I would notice is that it would appear as an accident in their chart. And I wouldn't call that fated. And I started to do readings, and I developed a reading called the Cosmic Death Chart reading, the Cosmic Grief reading. Sorry, the Cosmic Grief reading. And the Cosmic Grief reading is essentially a connection to the astrology charts and also the relationship with the person that is inquiring. Okay. And usually it's because the person inquiring hasn't found closure or is really struggling with the person's death. So, for instance, some people would come to me about the soul's purpose. In other words, like they're like, well, did my dad finish what he was supposed to do here? And what was his purpose? And why did he die now when I was about to have my baby? And why not, 6 months after my baby was born, for instance? Okay. And these kinds of questions come up in mediumship. And sometimes as a mediumship, you can't always answer that question. And sometimes it's not always clear. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to answer super complicated questions from spirits. Like you can try to connect with a spirit on the other side, and it's just harder for them to communicate some information. And now my guides have started to communicate with me through astrology. So they'll actually give me symbology that is used in astrology, such as Saturn or Uranus or Mars. Okay. And these kinds of planets, we all know as astrologers, are symbolic of something. They symbolize a particular type of energy or action or something that's happening to the person at the moment. Okay. And so then I would take that symbology. And since the other thing about mediumship is that the more you talk about a person that has passed, the more their energy comes up, comes up, right? And this is a well-known fact for most mediums. Most mediums know this. Most people that deal with spirits on the other side will talk about this. The more that you talk about the person on the other side, the more their energy comes closer to us. And so I usually start with their birth chart, the person that's past birth chart. And this right here provides a lot of validation for the person that's getting the reading. If they're not familiar with astrology, this will be incredibly wide. It usually leaves them wide-eyed because the astrology in itself, we know as astrologers, is pretty accurate about when we look at a chart. We can tell a lot about a person's personality, who they were, what they did in life, what kind of work they did, and, things like that, things about their personality. So you would just read the natal chart like you normally would. Okay. And then that usually is about a third of the reading, maybe less, depending on how I feel how much validation that person might need. And some people need more than others. And that's just a feel or a sense that I think that mediums come into understanding when they work with certain people. And then after some time, after we do that reading, then after we do that reading, that part of the reading, then I start to move in and I put the death chart with it, almost like in a synastry reading. I put the two together so I can almost see like the transits of that person at the time of their death. Now, I will admit, I have a Libra moon and it is in the 12th house. So it's pretty easy for me to imagine what someone else's situation would be like, especially looking at their astrology chart and the transits at the moment. But the transits are really helpful, especially in situations where the person took their own life. When we talk about this really incredibly sensitive topic, I've worked with parents that have lost their children, and this is really hard for them because a lot of times they take the blame, and there can be a lot of difficult conversations about this, okay? And this is just a really hard conversation to have. And I feel like the astrology softens it a little bit. We're able to see what was going on in that person's life at that time, what part of the cycles they were in and not in. And maybe the young person hadn't quite matured yet or realized that life was much bigger than what happened this week, right? And to come to understand other challenges that that person might have had, okay? And especially with young people. I've definitely I spoke to many um many parents that really suffered because of the loss of their child, okay? And I would say that just knowing their emotional and spiritual state at the moment, like sometimes I can see that they might have been a little obsessed with death at the moment. Maybe Mars was on their Pluto in the eighth house. Okay. And that can kind of leave a person a little bit more like kind of obsessed with death in a way. And sometimes this happens with young people, especially if they're experiencing depression or other mental health challenges. And so it can help a parent to know that the child was having an energetic experience at the time that led them to that. Was it destined? I still always tell parents and people that it's never destined to take one's own life. Although there have been times that I have seen things where the nodes have aligned at the time the person took their life, and those are very rare situations. And often those people are like they might be living in an institution, maybe living with something like schizophrenia or something like that, paranoid schizophrenia. I did see it once in a person like that. Her brother lived with paranoid schizophrenia and escaped the institution and took his own life. And that was pretty much all that happened. He didn't hurt anyone else or whatever. And she just wondered if it was. So I think these parents really need that extra support. They need to understand what the perspective of that was because as a medium, we all know if you've ever been a medium, if you've ever done mediumship, any kind, whether you've done it professionally or not, you know that the people that you're talking to are struggling with grief, huge questions that are really hard to answer specifically in mediumship. Sometimes we kind of get like this rounded answer that sounds like it came from, the other side, and it's very sort of rounded or generic, and it can be hard for the person to really comprehend what we're trying to say. But in astrology it's a little bit more specific, like me being able to say, oh, was your son sometimes seem a little obsessed with death? Like, was there something going on with his interest? And then the mother says, "Oh yeah, in his on his phone when we after he passed, we looked at his phone and he had all of these videos saved from people, taking their own life, for instance." Okay, and and then I can say, okay, at the time, this is what was happening in the stars. And while I don't think it was destined for your son to take his own life, he was feeling a little obsessed with death at the moment, and that wasn't your fault. So sometimes they're just born that way, right? Sometimes people are just born interested in certain darker topics. And while that's okay, sometimes it can lead people to think that that's the way they want to go, right? So, so that's an instance in which you can learn very quickly that that can be very helpful for the people that are left behind. And in the transits, when you put the second chart up, you'll be able to see the transits in the moment. You'll be able to see like what else was going on for that person in the moment. Like sometimes people are had some relationship problems. Now, once we move out of people taking their own life and we move more into like people that got sick or people that were that had accidents, a lot of times the accidents will show up with transits with Uranus and Mars. So it could either be their Uranus Mars, or like being transited maybe by a node, like the north node usually, sometimes the south node, and then also sometimes the the natal Uranus would be transited by Mars or the North Node. When you see that, oftentimes it was an accident. And so I'm able to say that, and that validation really helps the person that, you know, the client that's come to see me about the reading. And this is a very powerful thing because for them, they don't fully understand the astrology and they're just looking for answers as to why did my son die in a car accident, and so or why did my 6-year-old get swept away in the ocean. Okay, so these are kind of hard things, and I look at the chart and a lot of times Uranus and Mars and the nodes are involved. Now, oftentimes with the north node, like for instance, Uranus transiting the north node. Now, it won't just be one transit, it will be several transits. It could be both, and it could be like 2 or 3 things happening at the same time. I do notice that when I look at it, it is not just one transit, it's 2 or 3 transits. So the natal Uranus could be visited by the North Node at the same time the transiting Uranus is on their Mars, and that person was having a really rough day. They got mad. They went for a car drive and they accidentally got in a car accident while speeding and they drove off the side of the road. Okay, for instance. And then also a lot of times Mercury in car accidents, Mercury will be involved. And so also I believe Mercury was also being transited by Mars. Okay, so those are some examples of ways that you can see it. So it's not just one transit, right? It's not just one transit. It's 2, 3, sometimes 4, 5 things will all line up and tell us the same story. They kind of lean into the same instance. And then I can say to the person, so did they die of a car accident? And then yes, okay. And see, this is not just validation. If you know anything about mediumship, you know that the person is looking for for validation so that they can be sure this is true. This is not just validation, but it usually also ends up being more information about what happened, because then I can say, did your son have an argument or something before he took that drive? Oh, yes, he was arguing with his wife at the time. Oh, I see. So he was angry and driving, and he had also been drinking. And those things all led to the car accident, you see. So then this kind of thing can really help draw a picture for someone, especially when they've lost their someone they really love or are connected to, such as their son or their child or their spouse. Okay. And when we look into those things, people are validated. They feel valid that, oh, okay, I was wondering if that's what happened. And then it's there in the planets. It's right there. And I show them right there on the chart. I point to it for them to see. And I explain what all of those transits mean. What does Mars mean? What does Uranus mean? And we all know Mars is action, anger, frustration, right? And it can symbolize any of those things. And Uranus is usually a surprise, an accident, not something usually easy. Sometimes it can be, but not always. And sometimes it's kind of like when things just kind of get wiped out, right? And Pluto obviously is sometimes part of the story, since Pluto represents death. Okay. And Pluto also represents things like power and control. And so when we start to get into that, that's when people start to recognize that maybe they were in a toxic relationship, or maybe they were struggling with their own toxic mental health things, or that they that it might have been destined. The North Node is on Pluto, and they suddenly got sick and passed. And that's when it's destined. And that's when we start to talk about soul agreements, where we've already agreed to die at a certain time in our life. And I would not always say that before we're born that there's an exact date that we're going to die. Like, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that along the way there are certain choices that we make that start to hone in those dates. And I would say that there are exit points that happen based on our birth chart and the transits at the moment. And like I said, it's not just one transit, it's usually numerous transits, it's several things at once. And that's not always what it means. Sometimes it means you might pass, but then sometimes it might mean that you just go through a major transformation. Maybe you get diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that makes you change the way you're living your life, or maybe something else happens in your life that changes the way you do things. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to die at those exit points, but once someone has passed, we can look at that and say if it was an exit point or not. And oftentimes I do find that exit points are usually destined. Although sometimes, like with a person that uses drugs, if you've ever noticed, sometimes people that use drugs, they use it for a long time and it seems like they're walking on the edge, and you're always kind of afraid that they might pass at any time. And then all of a sudden they pass. And that's probably because Saturn's been warning them about it for years, and they chose not to listen. Just like a person may choose not to listen to like an invitation to quit smoking cigarettes, right? And sometimes that's the soul's journey, is to have that journey. And I think learning the value of human life is sometimes part of our journey. That's why we're here as souls here on earth. That's why we're here. And I think that sometimes those exit points, they happen throughout our lives, and sometimes we're aware of them and sometimes we're not. And I think that that depends on the choices we've made. It certainly is obvious that sometimes some people make some choices in their life that ends their life early. And some people are faced with unbelievable circumstances that weighs them down so much, and they're sort of forced to make those decisions in a way, or overwhelmed by what has happened to them, that they make decisions that lead to that. But not everybody does that. Why? And I think that that has a lot to do with a person's astrology. And I think sometimes we are destined. Some of us are destined to push through even in impossible circumstances, because there are obviously circumstances where people push through that are in impossible situations, yet they push through and persevere. So, and I think that that's part of the soul's journey. And sometimes maybe we have to prove it to ourselves that we can do it. And maybe some of those people have to prove to others that they can do it. Or maybe they're here for some sort of karmic contract. And all of those things could be found in the chart. A lot of karmic contracts involve Saturn and the North Node and the South Node. And we can see that. So the third part of the cosmic grief reading is when I add the third chart, which is the person that is sitting in front of me, the person that's come to me and said, can you please help me understand this death more deeply? And and this can really help you put together for that person the relationship. And sometimes that relationship is a soul contract, sometimes it's a soulmate. And there are usually with a soul contract, it definitely involves the nodes, it definitely involves the south node, sometimes usually Saturn, sometimes Neptune. And when those are alignments, when we see there's certain alignments, we can know that this was a soul contract for this person. And usually soul contracts, we have no choice in the matter. So sometimes that could be like your mom or something like that, okay? Or a sibling, okay? And then with for me, I have different definitions for these types of soul contracts. Of course, none of this is written in stone. It does seem to work for a lot of my clients when I explain it, that soulmates are people that come from the same soul, and that oftentimes that soul is from their it's from many lifetimes ago, and I believe that most of us live many lifetimes. Probably we most of us have probably lived 100 or more lives, okay? And in those lifetimes, somewhere along the way, we were presented to be in a war or something like that, and we had to take someone else's life. And these types of actions split the soul. It's not a punishment, it's a way for the universe to make sure that we start to move towards a better source of human, a better form of human. And so this would be like, um, someone in a war, and then if you talk to vets, people that have been in a war and have had to bomb somebody or kill somebody, even if the person was an enemy, it's still they'll say that it split their soul. And they don't even realize what they're saying. And a lot of times they'll just say, yeah, it's a heavy thing and it's hard for them to talk about. And I think that that's important for us to talk about, that even when we think we're doing the right thing, that sometimes it doesn't always feel good for the soul. And so those souls split. It's not a punishment, it's a way for the universe to help you learn why we learn that violence and things like that is wrong, and why we don't kill each other. And so that soul is split, and the soul is in sort of lives with each other, and they come back and they might have all sorts of relationships with each other to continue to learn from each other. And sometimes the soul can split more than once, right? With more extreme situations, okay? And then eventually two people come together and they live like a whole lifetime together. And sometimes it's like a mother and a son, and let's say the son may have even been challenged with some physical disabilities or something, and the mother lived with him. I actually knew a mother and son like this, and I looked at their astrology, and then the mother and son died together, like within months of each other. The mother died. I mean, she was old. She was like 80s or something, and she died, and her son was in his 40s. And, he was in an institution, and she passed. And I felt like their soul was reunited. And so did their family member that had come to see me. And they felt that that was true, that they were soulmates and that they did come back together. The mother had taken care of him his whole life, and he got moved to an institution when she passed. And then he just passed. He died. And while he may have been young, but maybe it was also time for their soul to come together. And as their soul came together, then that soul is now one again. You see, so the soul reunites, and that's what a soulmate is. And that's why a soulmate feels so compelling, because the soul is like cut from the same cloth. And when you look at them in their astrology chart in the synastry, you can actually see that they're almost cut from the same cloth, that they're very similar. And sometimes they may drive each other crazy because they're so alike. And then I also have the belief system of twin flames. And twin flames are two people that are more like on the astrology chart, they're a little bit more opposite. And when they're opposites, they still sometimes might have their nodes aligned or maybe not, but they tend to be kind of opposite of each other, but they don't have lots of oppositions necessarily, but they might have a bunch of squares, but they may also have a bunch of trines. When I say opposite, I mean like if you put their charts together, they're kind of like, filling up different areas of the chart. And they may not have perfect oppositions, but when you put the two charts together, they kind of balance together in a way. And this creates what I would call twin flames, which are two people that come together and bring the best of each other. Now, there is always a potential for someone to have free will and make bad choices. And let's just say they choose to um, they stay addicted. Maybe they just have a really hard time quitting drugs or whatever it is, or they choose some other addiction. And addiction is a sad thing, and there are treatments for it. And some people still, I do think that there is some choice in it. I do believe that it's also a a disorder, and that we have to help people with it. It's definitely related to mental health for sure. And I believe that we have to help people with it. Okay. So that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that those people sometimes get stuck in that, and it doesn't mean that the other person is stuck with no partner ever again. So this person, let's just say was a drug addict and they can't be with their twin flame. So now they have nobody. They have their soulmate died, their twin flame is a drug addict, and now they have nobody. I don't think that's true. I actually think what is true is that there are other many, many soulmates and many twin flames out there for you. We're immensely compatible in many ways, and that the universe is much larger and much more complicated and not very black and white, as much as we would like to make it black and white. But these are some of the things that I try to help people see in the relationships, especially widows, because sometimes they're young widows and they lost their spouse or whatever. And now this person that they were partners with, let's just say for 20, 30 years, now do they have to be alone forever? I'm going to be the one to probably tell them no. You don't have to be alone forever. You can move on. And in fact, this is how your spouse will help you. And I will use the astrology to help them do that. Okay. So this is where we talk about karmic agreements, soul contracts, soulmates, and there's lots of different situations that I could go into detail with. And if I was teaching a class or something, but then the soul contracts and the karmic agreements can be seen in the astrology, usually involving things like the nodes, especially the south node has a lot to do with like past life contracts, especially like south node on somebody's Saturn, um, the south node on the sun, on the person's sun, that sometimes will show, especially because in medical astrology, the sun identifies vitality. It means the person's vitality, like how long they might live or how strong they'll live and how that works. And sometimes when a person's sun is conjunct a person's, let's say, south node, and the person's sun was, let's say, afflicted, and let's just say they ended up having a heart attack, and the person's south node is on there. And I've had this exact example before I can think of in my head, where the south node was on the sun, And I said to her, "This is your husband." And I could see in his chart that, his sun was in in Leo, so he had a strong heart, but so the sun was in Leo, but it was probably afflicted. I think it was afflicted by Mars. So sometimes he would get really stressed, and she swore that the stress was one of the things that hurt him because he had a very stressful job. And she swore that this is one of the things that created the heart attack that he suffered from, and her south node was on it. Now, she had some other alignments as well that showed me that the two of them were very, very much soulmates, and they were very connected. They were very with each other. And they were very well suited, and they had a relationship for like 25, 30 years. And what I said to her was, especially since at that time, the south node, which was on his sun, was also being transited by things like Venus, Lilith, and Mars. And I thought that that was really interesting. And I told her, and Venus was direct, but in her natal chart, Lilith was retrograde. And I asked her what was I asked her for one of the things that she was struggling with most, which was to live on her own now without a husband. And she said yes. And I could tell by their synastry that that's what was going on. And I told her, and at the time of his passing, right, the transit was happening, and essentially saying to her, now you have to learn how to live on your own, how to be an independent woman. And in her progress chart, Lilith had gone direct, which I thought was interesting. And so she was learning that, and she was having to manage money and sell the house that she didn't want to live in anymore. There was a lot of things that were happening in her life that were pointing to exactly that, including at the time of his death, that transit happening on her south node and happening on his sun, right? Okay. And so that tells you a lot about not only his passing, which was sudden, and the Leo rules the heart, by the way. Okay. And the sun was in Leo. I mentioned that, right? Okay. And so at the moment, it created this like shake in their world. And while he passed, it was sort of saying to her, okay, so now it's your turn to learn to live as an independent woman so our souls can come back together in the next lifetime, so that you can be more of an independent woman in your next lifetime. And that's probably because their souls were working to come back together as one, right? Okay. And she was very validated by this. This was really good for her. And she came back to me, and I actually helped coach her for a long time, grief coaching, and we used her astrology chart to help her find her independence. She did eventually sell her house. She did eventually live on her own and learn to manage her money on her own without her husband. Not the easiest thing for her to do, but she did it. And she did it knowing that this is what they agreed to before, and that they had lived many years together, and many more years were promised to the both of them in the next lifetime. And that the best thing that they could do, best thing she could do in this lifetime, was to not only do what she had to do as an independent woman and stand up for herself and things of this nature, but she also had to get in touch with the women, the girls. She had 2 daughters, women in her life, and she now has a grandchild. Okay. So I feel like these stories are just one after another, after another, after another. And she just needed that validation in the reading where it could see what her relationship was with her husband, and I could also see that at the time of the death, she was having a transit to her south node. And almost anyone that studies nodal astrology will tell you that those are very powerful transits. When something is transiting your node or the node is on something in your chart, it's changing something for you. And for her, it's about a past life with this man. And it was about letting go of the way she was born, which was in, not an independent woman. She was born even in a country where women were oppressed. And so she had to leave that country to become empowered. And that's part of what her husband did for her. But then he passed. And in his passing, he also did that for her. You get what I'm saying there. So it's a very karmic agreement, and it's a very complicated process that you unwind, and that I can unwind in an hour. But it takes not just the astrology, it also takes the intuition of the mediumship. It takes using the messages from my spirit guides and the person's, the person on the other side. I tap into what they're saying, because they'll say, look at my Saturn, look at my Mars, look at my sun. And then I see. Okay. And then it can help me help the person, see what was meant to happen at the time of the death. Because now you have the birth chart of the person that's passed, and you have the birth chart of the person that's sitting in front of you. You also have the chart of the moment that person died. And the moment that person died was obviously impactful to that person that's sitting in front of you, to your client. And so you can look at that moment and say, at that moment, this happened because it was meant to teach you this. Because a lot of times in grief, people will have a lot of why questions. Why did this happen? Why now? And a lot of times they don't understand. But with those insights in the astrology, can really give them some insights as to why. And the why answer is hard to answer as a medium. I found it next to impossible. I could get all kinds of evidence, and I could bring loving messages through, supportive messages in whatever they were doing in their life. But it was very difficult to bring in to answer those kinds of questions as a medium. But once I brought the astrology in, it brought a level of detail and a level of answers that they could really hold on to, that would really help them transform and help them to find healing in the grief. Now, I have an education in mental health and in grief and trauma, so it was easy for me to see how to help people heal and to see what the astrology was speaking to in their mental health. And this can really help people. I've noticed that it works better not for people fresh in grief. It feels like people fresh in grief, like in the first month, 1 to 3 months, depending on who it was and the situation. But 1 to 3 months, they need to just see mediums, and just getting the connection to the other side is often enough. But then later, 6 months down the road, a year, when they're trying to come to acceptance, those are the people that I end up helping the most. Those are the people that truly are helped by this cosmic grief reading. And the interesting thing about this is that, like, for instance, a woman came to me sort of against my opinion that people should wait until they're 3 or more months beyond the death. She was only a couple weeks in. And she came to me anyway for the cosmic grief reading, and I did it. And there were some things that she couldn't comprehend. She couldn't even understand them. But no worries, because I recorded it and I sent it to her. And then later, she said that she just didn't really think, like, at first, she was not able to comprehend most of what I was saying because she was just too deep into grief. And that's an interesting thing about mental health, because grief will sort of block you from being able to take in certain information. When you're traumatized, it's understood that the frontal lobe shuts down and it's hard to take in certain information. So, so she just kind of cast it aside and didn't think about it. And then she was cleaning her computer and found the video and she watched it. And at this point, when she watched it again, it was over a year later. And she realized that everything I was saying was exactly, and I validated her entire grief journey in the recording. I validated exactly where she was going and what was about to happen. And she just had to come back to me. And she did. And she thanked me because she, at the time of finding it, she actually was struggling with acceptance. And so it really helps people in the late stages of grief get to that last acceptance piece. Now, grief happens in different stages and people jump back and forth, and it's not always a straight road. In fact, usually it's not. But um but as they get to acceptance once, I find that it's easier for them to get to acceptance again. And so once they get there once, it will be easier for them to get there again and again and again, and then hopefully stay there for the most of their lives after that, helping them to accept that the person is past, accept that the relationship is now different, accept that this is part of an agreement, a bigger picture, a bigger part of the universe, and accept that there is more to come. And that's really what my message is about, is that most of our lives are interconnected with others in a huge way, in a bigger way, in a big, huge way. And our lives are much bigger than just this lifetime. And while we might stay focused on just this lifetime, the truth and the reality is that it's usually much, much bigger. And so once I start to point to that, people are inspired and they're able to move on and find acceptance in a way that can really feed their hearts. And I think that then it also helps them paint their own picture. So once they figure out, okay, well, this happened to my dad, and while it was sucky that he died just, right before my baby was born, now I'm realizing maybe this was part of the journey and this is part of the soul contract with my baby and my dad. And and that kind of understanding, then what happens is then they start to wonder about their own soul contract, their own journey, their own life journey, and how that's reflected in the astrology chart, bringing them to a deeper understanding of exactly how life can unfold for us in much deeper ways, and how these cycles in our life are leading us to something much bigger, and that the universe is kind and loving, just as Nadiya would say. And I quote her all the time and tell people that Nadiya Shah would teach that the universe is kind and loving, and that is true. The universe is usually trying to lead you in a wonderful, uplifting place. It's trying to lead you to growth, and sometimes growth, like I was just listening, that stress creates growth in everything in nature. Everything in nature needs stress to grow, including humans. And so it can be really, astrology, as we all know, can be really powerful in helping you to understand where your journey is going, why this is happening right now, even in other things, not just with death, but with other major things that happen, like the loss of a job or the politics or other things like that. And when we feel lost like that, if we turn to the astrology chart, we are given meaning, which can help us navigate to something that feels a little bit better. And I think that if they're interested in their own soul contract, then their life becomes more meaningful and it becomes more purposeful, and they are more driven to do things that are good for them. And I also teach that ancestral work is good for all of us, because when we recognize death as a normal part of life, life and death exist in the same. Without life, we wouldn't have death, and without death, we wouldn't have life. And that's just how it is. And I believe that learning about death early on and getting connected to death will help you when it is time for someone to die, because then you have a bigger understanding of exactly what that means. And, I myself have been through really hard losses. I lost my father when I was 25, and that's part of what led me to mediumship. But I was already connecting and communicating with spirits before that. But I don't think I fully comprehended the impact of death until I lost my father. And then as I started to read for others, I started to realize the impact of what it felt like to lose someone that you really, really love and that you really do miss. And how having a relationship with them in ancestral work can really help heal the wound of losing someone. And, you know, and people say, how can you be sure that there is another side and things like that? And I always remind people that mediumship is an act of faith. So this means that mediumship in itself is an act of faith. So there's no proof ever. But what I always say is, does it serve you to believe or not believe? If it serves you to believe and you feel better, you feel held, you feel more connected to the ones you've lost, and it softens the blow of someone that has died, then you're not hurting anyone. And you're definitely not hurting yourself. You're helping yourself. And I believe all of us have the ability to connect to our ancestors on the other side, our loved ones on the other side. We all have the ability to connect with them all the time. We just have to learn it. It's like a skill, like learning to read astrology. And I would also say that, the ancient wisdom of connecting to your ancestors, the way we've followed them around Samhain, around this time of year in October, and doing ancestral work and all of that is an ancient tradition for a reason. And I think that the ancient traditions of Samhain are powerful and important because it helps us recognize that our life is precious in every moment and that death could be around the corner. And the best thing you could do is make the best of every moment. You can't predict when it's going to happen. And I don't try to do that in my death astrology. What I do is I use the chart after the person died. I think that's where death astrology has its most power, is to helping to understand a person after they died, because the grieving are the ones that need to understand it, because once they're on the other side, they have everything they need over there. They can see the truth of things. They know the understand of things. They understand things more deeply than we do. They know things we don't. And as a medium, I fully and completely believe that. And I have been supported by my father since he passed when I was 25. And I've been doing medium readings and seances since then. I've done all kinds of work with all kinds of different traditions and different paths. And I have experienced many different types of mediumship. And what I would say is that the astrology adds a level to it that creates insightfulness and healing, especially for your client. And when we find peace and meaning, even in the face of loss, we can honor our past loved one's soul journey, and life has a whole lot more meaning. And now it's not just about what they did for a living or anything else. Now it's more meaningful. And I think in that, it helps and provides healing.
Thanks so much for spending time with us this week.